Um, our speaker tonight, it's no exaggeration to say, is one of the world's top experts on a rather tough subject, terrorism, also aviation and transport safety. Brian Jenkins has been doing this for over 40 years, and in fact, that's one of the reasons that we wanted to talk to him tonight. I looked back over our records, and he had first spoken to us in 1973. And the takeaway from that is, thank goodness the bad guys haven't got you since. 43 years with regular mentions in Al-Qaeda magazines and so on as somebody. Sometimes they actually kind of like what you say, but he's now the senior advisor to the president of RAND Corporation, which he joined back in 1972 after he'd been a captain in the US Special Forces in Vietnam. And he very early on got into the whole area of political violence. And one of the things we'll talk about tonight is what political violence stroke terrorism looked like then and what it looks like today. From 1989 to 1998, he was deputy chairman of Kroll Associates. He's been an advisor to the White House on a number of things, including aviation safety and the National Commission on Terrorism. He helped investigate the 1983 bombing of the US Marine Corps barracks in Beirut, which left, I think, 242 people dead and ultimately led to our retreat from Beirut in those days. He also investigated the 1988 Pan Am Lockerbie bombing. He's advised various bodies, including the Church of England and I believe the Catholic Church, on the Western hostages who were taken in Beirut. He's pretty much done everything. He's written extensively, and we're delighted that he can join us here tonight, Brian. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
So as we talked about this, and as I indicated, precisely because you spoke to us first in 1973, a year when terrorism looked like pub bombings in Northern Ireland and, I guess, Palestinians taking airliners, hijacking airliners. What did you think the major terrorist threats were to us then? What did you think was coming down the pike? And if you can look backwards, how did you do in your assessment?
Well, in terms of what was on our mind, to say that terrorism, to say in 1972, 1973, when we began this research, that terrorism was likely to increase, was going to become increasingly international. It could affect the United States in a variety of ways, which we should prepare for. That was not difficult. One only had to take a small step or two beyond the headlines of the day. There had been hijackings of airliners by terrorists. There had been kidnappings of diplomats. There had been assassinations. There had been bombings, and so clearly there was a trend. Having said that, were I to have, with far more prescience than I possessed, had actually outlined what took place in the subsequent 40 years, I'm certain I would have suffered Cassandra's fate. No one would have believed me. Rand would have dispatched me from Rand over to Hollywood to write scripts. But if you think about it, the bombings, the blowing up of embassies, the blowing up of airliners, the nerve gas on Tokyo's subways, the 93 World Trade Center bombing, 9/11 itself, a global war on terror, targeted killings. None of this, I think that we didn't envision that in 1973. What we saw then were a set of tactics that were outside of any rules of war, that were certainly crimes, but not even permitted in warfare, but which were becoming increasingly popular among various irregular organizations around the world, and that was spreading. as I say, from there, the escalation, some of the changes were far beyond. At the same time, terrorists did not do some of the things that we worried most about. We worried a great deal about biological terrorism. We worried about nuclear terrorism at the time. I thought it unlikely that we would see nuclear terrorism, and thank goodness it hasn't occurred. So terrorists have not done all of the terrible things that kept us up at night, but they've done vastly more than we anticipated they ever would.
Looking back over those 4+ decades, were there any things that you got wrong that you think you should have got right? Clearly, there are black swans you can never predict, but are there any things that you think in retrospect, gosh, I should have got that? It was, the evidence was there, I just didn't see it.
Yes. I'm certain the list of things that I got wrong is longer than the list of things I got right. But one of the striking things, at that time, and we spent a lot of time looking at weapons. What weapons would terrorists in the future? Now we're talking about in the 70s. What weapons would they use? And so we were looking at all of the weapons developments that were being done, precision-guided munitions, heat-seeking surface-to-air missiles. We were attempting to say what is going to replace the AK-47s that was the primary weapon of choice of terrorists in the 1970s. And we missed it. We missed it, and I'm particularly tough on myself on this one because we missed it because I should have known better, because my own dictum was that terrorism is about communications, primarily. Terrorism is about manipulation of an audience. Terrorism is violence that is choreographed to achieve psychological effects. Terrorism is aimed at the people watching. It's not about battles. It's not about winning battles and infantrymen battles. So what was the single technology that completely went past us? Of course, it didn't even exist until the latter part of the 70s. The internet. The internet has allowed terrorists to reach audiences of global proportions, to spread their propaganda, to recruit followers worldwide, indeed to create online communities of supporters, and to even create new kinds of virtual organizations, networks, instead of military formations. And that was the most profound development in the terrorist arsenal, I think. Insofar as the actual weapons, the Kouachi brothers, when they attacked Charlie Hebdo offices in Paris, Koulibaly, when he attacked the kosher delicatessen in Paris, the fellow that just recently was going to carry out an attack on a train from Brussels to Paris, they're still armed with AK-47s. It's the internet, not the infantrymen weapons that have changed.
Terrorism sometimes works, sadly.
It does. No, terrorists have been able to certainly manipulate fear, to create fear. They've been able to gain, in some cases, some tactical concessions. They have been able to win, in a sense, some of the psychological battles. They have certainly been able to cause widespread disruption, widespread alarm, which has obliged us to divert vast resources to counter terrorism. They have changed us a great deal. And in that sense, terrorism has worked. what they have had more difficulty doing is translating those successes into concrete political gains for themselves. If you take their own strategic aims, only rarely did they achieve anything close to what they set out to achieve.
I'm thinking of the IRA. They basically forced the British government to share power in Northern Ireland by bombing their soldiers.
They did, and that's an example. There's only a handful of cases where you can say, look, there was a measure of success here. It was truly a compromise because they didn't set out to persuade the British government to share power. They set out to take over the 6 counties of Northern Ireland.
Yeah, fair point.
And take them out of the United Kingdom. And after 25 years of shooting and bombing, they had to give that one up. But they did ultimately persuade the British government that it could only end the violence, end the troubles, with a political arrangement that brought these people into the political system. Now, what is interesting about that is that meant ultimately negotiations with terrorists. And that's tough for governments. That's very, very tough for governments to do.
Leading on from that, I remember at the time, when I grew up in Ireland, there were various movies made, and there was one I recall. There was this character, we never saw him, Red George. And when the IRA were putting bombs in pubs, whatever, there would be a phone call, and it would be Red George. This is Red George speaking, you got 5 minutes to get out. And it was a warning. Terrorists don't give warnings anymore. There was no warning in the World Trade Center. You know, you got half an hour to get out before those jets crash in, or even, Baghdad car bombs. They don't call up police station and say there's a car bomb in the Sur Square, you need to get out. What has changed there?
Constituency. How you define your constituency. Not just the IRA, but a number of the groups that were active in Europe, for example, in the early 70s, like the IRA. They didn't always give the warnings as the IRA did, but they were very cautious about how they applied violence. As I put it in one thing I wrote long ago, terrorists then wanted a lot of people watching, not a lot of people dead. We knew they were capable of doing more than they did. So why didn't they? If it wasn't operational constraints, then there must be self-imposed constraints. What were those? And it turns out that over a period of years, by looking at trial records, by talking to people in prison, we gradually figured out what these were. First of all, there were, even on the part of some we labeled terrorists, there were moral considerations. There was a morality. This is legitimate, this is not legitimate. Now, not every group and not everyone in every group agrees where that morality lies, but there was a concept that there's a notion of morality. A second factor was group cohesion. The group has to go along with this. We're not talking about disciplined armies that take their orders and carry them out. This is a group decision, and if you do something that the group is unwilling to go along with, then you risk a portion of that group betraying the operation and perhaps the organization. But the most important one is how you define constituency. And the IRA had constituents. It had constituents in Ireland, and it had constituents in America. And the IRA figured out, and if we go too far, we lose support of our constituents. We alienate our perceived supporters, and they always imagine themselves, perhaps, they have more supporters than they really did, but it worried them. So we cannot go too far, our contributions from America will decline. People will turn on us. So the violence becomes this sort of it's like the volume control on an old television set, one of these things you're trying, just enough to get everyone to listen, but not so loud that people will leave the room. And that was there. What happened as we moved into the 1980s, more and more terrorism was driven by ideologies based upon religious faith or based upon ethnic divisions in which the other, whoever that ethnic other was, is subhuman, or in the case of religion, they're pagans or they're infidels. They're going to burn in hell anyway. Our constituency is God. We only answer to God. And so whatever God tells us, whether it's through the mouth of some mad mullah or crazy preacher, is okay. And that is right and moral, because we don't have a constituency here. And so terrorism changed. We saw this. Terrorism in the 1970s, in terms of the worst incidents, was measured in terms of fatalities in the tens. In the 1980s, this ascended to the hundreds, the worst incidents, hundreds of dead. On 9/11, it turned into the thousands. I mean, we were on a path that basically was almost an order of magnitude increase every decade. And in the immediate shadow of 9/11, people were worried about terror scenarios in which tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, might die. And the difference, again, in that was constituency.
Because right now, if we look at ISIS, the more violent they are, it seems the more attractive they are, at least to their constituency, as you define it.
The Islamic State recruits with two main messages. One is, we are authentic. We are true in our faith. Their 7th century version of this faith, and we demonstrate our authenticity through our cruelty, through our brutality. But the brutality is also a recruiting poster. It is basically telling people, join us and there are opportunities for unlimited violence. Now, this is getting them, people who are not only motivated by belief in that ideology, but this is getting them a self-selecting bunch of thugs who it's going to be very hard for them to control in the long run. And if you look at the numbers, we're talking about right now about 25,000 or so foreign fighters have joined jihadist groups, primarily ISIL, the Islamic State. If you look at their total numbers, that represents a large proportion of their total strength. These people can be motivated to kill. They cannot be constrained from not to kill. And so they begin to warp the trajectory of the organization in the direction of ever increasing brutality. And ultimately, I'm persuaded that will lead to their destruction. That will lead to defections of their own members.
I wonder if we can talk about the US response. I'm interested in the National Security Directive that President Reagan wrote. I think it was in 84.
Yes.
After there was no response to the Marine Corps barracks bombing, in the sense that we didn't know who to hit. We had a vague idea it was Iran, maybe some Syrian. We didn't really know. Anyway, nothing was seen to have been done in public. And in the senior policy circles in Washington, that was felt to have been a mistake, that the US needed to show more force. And Reagan came out with this National Security Directive, which at the time was top secret. Was that a well-conceived directive? And what have been the effects of that in the years that followed?
You have to back up and take a running start to get it into context here. I mean, when we looked at terrorism in the 1970s, our framework was the individual terrorist incident. We didn't engage directly with the terrorists. I mean, when urban guerrillas in Brazil or Uruguay or Argentina or Guatemala or the Middle East kidnapped American diplomats or hijacked American aircraft, we did not see ourselves engaging directly with them. That was a Brazilian problem or an Uruguayan problem or a Spanish problem, not an American problem. Our problem was that incident. And so the way we framed it is we wanted to ensure that the United States would create international consensus against these individual terrorist tactics. We would protect ourselves by basically getting international cooperation in outlawing terrorism. Now, we ultimately did that. It took us about 30 years. But ultimately, there was an international convention to cover almost everything terrorists did. Didn't stop terrorism, but it increased international cooperation. But the fact that terrorism continued and it began to affect us more directly, our framework began to shift, and we said, we are not just opposed to the individual terrorist act through diplomacy and application of law. They are attacking us. We have to be able to fight back. And so we began to shift over to applying force to the group. And so it wasn't a matter of you attack us, we will reach into the international legal regime to attempt to block you in some way. We will come back direct. This was a huge debate in the policy circles. The military did not want any part of this mission. The notion that the military was enthused about war on terrorism, even after 9/11, is just not true. The United States military had been through a searing experience in Vietnam. The United States military regarded the Vietnam War as a debacle, a catastrophe. Not simply because people turned against the war, people turned against the military. When I came back from my tours in Vietnam, you didn't wear your uniform. You kept your mouth shut. And it was that intensity of feeling against the military that the military, in a sense, as an institution, made a decision. We are never going to get ourselves in this kind of a mess again. And the way we will avoid it is we will erase from the curriculum, erase from the doctrine, any capacity to fight anything other than our preferred war. And so they actually had a doctrine that said these are the wars we're going to fight. There'll be, clear-cut objectives, clear-cut threat, an enemy who looks very much like us or like the Soviet Union. That was it. And we're not going to be dragged off and fight irregular forces in exotic parts of the world. With the attack on the Marine barracks, that was a changing point. And it was, if we don't strike back, then our diplomacy is undercut. No one will do anything because there's nothing to back it up. So this is a philosophical debate. You go back to Thucydides for debates like this in history. And in that debate, George Shultz, who I just saw last spring, man's in his 90s, writing another book yet, sharp as a tack. And he said, the United States cannot take punches forever. We have to be able to strike back. That was the debate. In the debate, finally, Shultz won over the Pentagon, and they crafted a national security directive that said we would have options for the application of military force. Now, think how far we've come since then. We have now, in response to terrorism, we said we will use military force to rescue hostages. We will use military force against terrorist organizations that attack us. We will use military force to bring down governments that give asylum or support terrorist groups that attack us. We will attack terrorists anywhere in the world. We will kill terrorist leaders, whether on the battlefield or off. We will carry out preemptive attacks if we think terrorists are preparing to attack us. And we will preemptively, in terms of current doctrine, attack any state who we think might assist terrorists to attack us. So intentions now are good enough to get a military strike back. There's not a hell of a lot we won't do now.
Let me just say that RAND is a great organization. One of the great things about RAND is they put everything online. So you can actually read everything that Brian has written since 1972, free. So I've read a lot. And there's one paper you wrote in 1987 on assassination. And you gave 10 arguments against US use of assassination against terrorists. And they were broadly, it's morally wrong, it's legally complicated, tactically wrong, and doesn't always work. How do you feel about that paper now? And how do you feel about our drone targeted killing program?
Certainly we have, as a nation, evolved on this particular issue. And I'll admit, this has been a struggle for me. And I should back up here and underscore one thing. You work on a topic of terrorism, and you think you're working on topics that have to do with tactics and weapons and security measures and things of that sort. No, what you really end up addressing are fundamental issues of philosophy, of morality. In a hostage situation, how do you bargain for human life? What is a human life worth versus national interests in terms of targeted killings? This is another one of these tough questions. On the one hand, when I wrote that paper in the 1980s, the issue before the government was whether or not we would carry out a campaign of assassination that looked like the only other model on display was the Israeli series of attacks after the Munich incident, a series of killings of Palestinian leaders who had been involved in planning and supporting the Munich incident. And I said, no, this does not make sense for us. It doesn't make sense for us on grounds of morality. It doesn't make sense for us on grounds of just practicality. In some cases, people were talking about targeting national leaders. Gaddafi, shouldn't we kill Gaddafi? Shouldn't we murder these leaders? And I said, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if we get into that kind of a battle and begin to legitimatize that we in our open society necessarily have an advantage there. Just for pragmatic reasons, put aside morality, this might not be the smartest thing we would do. So where am I now on this thing? And it is still tough. In circumstances of war, and I think whatever we choose to call it, or are determined not to call it, we are engaged in an ongoing war with Al-Qaeda and its offspring. That in the context of war, killing enemy commanders is legitimate. That is, during World War II, when we had an opportunity to shoot down the airplane that was carrying Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, we did it. That, by the way, decision went all the way to the president, all the way to the White House. It was decided, you do it. And so, therefore, in the broadest moral and legal sense, you can say Al Qaeda has declared war on us formally. We have formally, with the authorization of use of military force passed by Congress in 2001, declared war on them. This is now within the domain of a legitimate mode of conduct. But, it is not a strategy, as some people think it is. It is not a solution. It has to be used with the utmost care, and this is one of those things where you look at each case at a time, you look at the probability of collateral casualties, you look at the importance of the individual, what that individual is doing, and it has had an effect in degrading the operational capabilities of our foes. And in those circumstances, I can, grit my teeth and say, okay, this is okay to do. And quite frankly, on the day when I learned that Osama bin Laden had been killed, it wasn't a matter of rejoicing. Soldiers don't rejoice at killing. It's not a trophy. It's not an achievement. It is a sense of that is now done. I frankly think after 9/11, in order not only to deal with Al-Qaeda, but in order to deal with future Al-Qaedas, it should be the position of the United States that we will relentlessly hunt down and capture or kill every single person that was involved in that organization that carried out that attack. And we will bring them to trial, we'll put them in prison. If we can't capture them and we can get a shot at them, we'll take that shot. That is our obligation, and I am okay with that.
Let me ask you finally, before I open up to the floor, compared to September 9th, 2001, we have invested a huge amount in counterterrorism. We've also created probably some more enemies by some of our actions. Someone turned something off. I'm wondering, do you think in balance, are we safer or less safe now than we were the day before 9/11?
Here I'll admit to you touching a nerve. And the nerve is the inevitable question that comes up. Are we safer now? I have to admit I detest this question because, and the reason the reason I detest it is it is analytically wrong, and to me it's un-American, and I'm not hitting you on it.
Guilty as charged.
No. It's safer now than when? I mean, okay, then September 9th, that's a baseline. And what does that mean? The answer is yes, that's easy. We are safer now. But the fact that question becomes the central question that drives all policy is pushing us toward becoming a security-obsessed state. We have, since 9/11, we've created a new corpus of law. We have created what has become in the Department of Homeland Security the third largest bureaucracy in the U.S. government. We have spent trillions of dollars in military operations and in security measures in order to, quote, make us safer. At a certain point, you want to push back to the American public and say, look, at the end of the day, our final defense against terrorism is not going to be how many more concrete ballards, how many more surveillance programs, how many more clearances, how many more fences, how many more laws we will have on this thing, at a certain point you want to say, look, we are America. We are a nation of courageous people. We are a self-reliant people. We have been through far worse than our history. Hell, it's ISIS. It's not the Wehrmacht. It's not the Soviet Union with 30,000 nuclear weapons pointed not at Paraguay, but pointed at us. This is ISIS. It is a problem. We will deal with it. We are not going to abolish risk from our society. And so, are we safer? I can never, if that is the sole question, short of creating a neo-medieval, incremental tyranny, achieve an absolute level of security for every single citizen of the United States. So at a certain point, you have to say, look, we have taken risks. In our history, we take risks every day. Terrorism is a relatively small one. We will deal with this, and we will deal with this effectively. But we are not going to, in the process, walk ourselves into changing America into something we don't want it to be.
Fair enough. We have a microphone here. If you put your hand up, we'll get to you.
Thank you. First, respectfully, rather than the U.S. handling ISIS, it appears to be Russia and Iran, with the Kurds again getting short shrift. But my question has to do with the consensus against terrorism. I mean, first of all, the definition of terrorism seems to continue to be elusive, and coincidentally perhaps, but it seems to be more or less a self-interested consensus around nations that happen to be NATO members, where we're achieving some degree of cooperation, at least on an Interpol level and such. We don't even seem to be able to get military cooperation.
In terms of cooperation, actually in terms of intelligence, one of the remarkable changes of the post-9/11 world is an unprecedented degree of cooperation among the intelligence services and law enforcement organizations worldwide, even among governments that politically have quite different views of the world. In terms of terrorism, there is a great deal of cooperation. In terms of military, here is a broader change taking place. An increasing portion of the world, especially the Western world, the EU, our NATO allies, do not see the use of military force as a viable, practical option. It's not the old-fashioned pacifism of the Cold War or going back to the 1930s. It is simply that war, in their view, is an irrelevant thing, something simply to be avoided. Their defense budgets have gone down, appropriately so in many cases. Their ability to mobilize even relatively small amounts of military power are quite limited. The air power of the EU is roughly equivalent to the Air National Guard of Texas. I mean, this is, and we talk about now in the face of, what is being portrayed as a more aggressive, a more bellicose Russia. It's not bellicose yet, but a more aggressive Russia toward the West, to move a battalion of troops about 800 men, is now a major issue. This is a heavy lift for our allies. Keep in mind, we used to have 400,000 troops stationed in Europe ourselves. We had armies that could move divisions, corps, entire field armies at a time. I'm telling you now that to move a battalion is a major, major issue. Because they have turned away from military force, in many cases people will say for selfish reasons, in many cases with the notion that, well, if there's heavy lifting to be done, the Americans will always do it. At the same time, this has led them to a very critical attitude toward any nation that ever does then apply military force. So on the one hand, in looking at a situation like Syria and Iraq, the very same people will denounce the United States for using military force and will say the United States must intervene in Syria and sort it out so that Europe is not flooded with 5 million refugees or 10 million refugees or 15. It's actually 16 million refugees now in Syria and Iraq. So in that sense, we're dealing with more fundamental changes in attitudes. There are only a handful of countries that still consider military force as a viable instrument of policy. Good or bad, that's a different question.
I'd like to know your views on the U.S. government's use of torture to extract information from terrorists. Can it be effective? Can it be appropriate?
We'll deal with the fundamental question, and we'll come to practicality. In my view, torture is never justified. It's just an absolute. It cannot be. Whatever information we might gain would be offset by the terrible strategic loss and cost we would pay in our own values. Now, I know people then regularly invent, I mean, this is the Jack Bauer 24 ticking clock scenario of, you know, the person that knows where the nuclear weapon is and you have 30 minutes, wouldn't you adopt torture? That's an interesting, fictional artifice. I've never in my life, by the way, in all the years I've dealt with, I've never seen the ticking bomb scenario in real life. I'll tell you what you get when you start torturing. What you get is a lot of crap. You get a lot of nonsense. Can people be forced to talk? Of course they can be forced to talk. They'll tell you all kinds of things. And it gets in the way of real intelligence. Now, will people who have authorized or engaged in torture say that it works? By the way, this is not something where you can conduct a psychological experiment. We can't say, we're going to take 10 people and tell them a secret and torture 5 of them and not torture the other 5. You don't get to do that. So what evidence do you have? So people who once they engage in it, they have to say it works. My God, if you've tortured someone and you say it doesn't work, what have you done? You have made yourself into a beast for no reason at all. And so, quite frankly, on this one, I disagree with him on a lot of things, but I think Senator McCain and I are on the same page on this one. Torture does not belong in the repertoire of this country. It is not what America does. And if that means we take an extra risk, we take the extra risk. There's no way. And then the idea that we can somehow legally justify it, it was some some person wrote, said, well, we'll have a judicial warrant for this. What judicial warrant could you get from what authority, claiming what jurisdiction that would authorize you to do that? This is not what we do.
I'd like you to speak about cyber espionage and the dangers it poses for the United States and what can be done. There have been terrible attacks, both corporate attacks, governmental, the Office of Public, I've forgotten the, but you know what I'm talking
Yes.
about.
The OPM, the
OPM,
personnel
right.
management.
And it's gotten to the point that it's not only dangerous for our organizations and for our corporations and for very important private information as well, but it's very dangerous for the nation, for all kinds of things being stolen, and what we can do about it.
It is an enormous danger, and it is an area where it has become not just the espionage, but various forms of disruption via the internet, which are potentially are possible. This is an area which has become a theater of war in which there are no rules yet. And eventually, I think we are going to see, if the internet is to survive. Now, there is a possibility that the global internet, as we know it, it's not inconceivable that that does not survive, that we build, in a sense, we build walls and defenses. They're electronic form, not the ones with big stones. And in a sense, we atomize, we balkanize the internet. So you have your internet, you have your internet, you have your internet. That's a possibility. But if we're going to have a global system on this, then it is going to require some rules. You've said it is dangerous. Right now, today, as we speak, there are meetings in Washington between the President of China, the President of the United States, that are discussing some of these breaches and what the rules will be. Now, in terms of espionage, that probably is going to continue. I mean, all through the Cold War, even while the United States stood nose to nose, nuclear weapons at the ready, we engaged in espionage against the Soviet Union. They engaged in espionage with us. Thank goodness, actually, because we knew what they were thinking and they knew what we were thinking, and that probably helped keep us out of some messes that might otherwise have occurred. But, so I think the espionage part is going to probably continue. That's still going to go on. But there's going to be some more fundamental rules about attacking government databases, things of this sort. At a certain point, people are going to decide this is an act of war. And we don't know where that line is yet. But this is, we're going to see over the next 10 years, 15 years, we are going to see the elaboration of a series of rules, which we're not going to end crime on the internet. We haven't eliminated crime on the streets. We're not going to eliminate espionage on the internet. We haven't eliminated that from the world either. Can we get this to an area where we are going to have some means of establishing some rules and some deterrent behind that is going to say, okay, this is tolerable, this is not tolerable, and figure out where those are. That's where we're going. As I say, otherwise, we unplug them.
Let's take two more, if that's okay.
The ISIS and others have been very effective in social media.
Yes.
What is your opinion as far as what we have done, what we haven't done, and what we might do?
First of all, in terms of effective in social media, and let's be careful here, ISIS has been because of the generation of the people involved, The communications from ISIS are very different from the communications of Al-Qaeda, which also used the internet. But Al-Qaeda was much more centralized, and it had, dull old guys with beards. And it wasn't, it was slick. Over a period of years, it got slick. It even had a crawl under Zawahiri talking and emblems and things like that. But it wasn't cool. ISIS has mastered the social media. Right now, there are about 90,000 tweets a day coming out of ISIS. But let's not make the mistake here. 90,000 tweets. I was at a meeting with officials in Washington, and they said, "My God, ISIS has 90,000 tweets a day. We've never seen a threat like this." And I said, "They're tweets." They're tweets. And they said, ISIS has got, 100,000 followers on social media. And I said, Justin Bieber has 40 million, so what? Let's not mistake the noise for a threat. A tweet is not a threat. Boasting, selfies, this is making a lot of noise. Now, interestingly enough, a lot of this is intended to inspire. Al-Qaeda does it, and ISIS does it, to exhort and inspire people to carry out terrorist attacks. I want to tell you, in the United States, they're not selling a lot of cars. That's just the good news. This is not an effective campaign. They're getting a person here, a person there. Very, very, very small response. And that's because the social media also comes with several built-in flaws. Okay, what are the built-in flaws on their side? Number one, it allows vicarious participation. So one can be a jihadist in social media and tweet like mad, then put your phone in your pocket and go out and get a beer. By the way, I said that I wrote the brothers that they were doing a lot of exhortation, but that the brothers weren't pushing back from the monitors and doing much. And one of a jihadist website got very, very angry at me because I said that. It's okay to call them terrorists, but you can't accuse them of substandard zeal. But so one reason, it allows vicarious participation. And you can boast, you can threaten, you can exhort each other to action, and that's it. It's like a video game. Nothing. Now, the second flaw that it has is that these people actually think that no one's listening to this, and that they can do this with impunity. It's not a secret. We do listen to the social media, and we watch it very, very carefully, and it is a rich source of intelligence. And it doesn't mean you go after every single individual that's shooting off his mouth, but when these things start to become more concrete and they start talking about specifics, they're going to attract the attention of the authorities, appropriately so. This is public space here. And so social media, good source of intelligence for us. I wouldn't shut it down. Wouldn't shut it down at all. And by the way, when these foreign fighters start drifting back, it is our source of forensic evidence that will bring them into courtrooms and convict them. All these guys taking selfies with their AK-47s and severed heads are providing the evidence that is going to be used. So intelligence, forensic utility, and as I say, the final thing, it also allows solitary activity. Now, why is that important? I mean, solitary. You don't have to get together in a group. You can be alone. I'm not going to say lone wolf. What a stupid term. You can be a lone, an individual by yourself. Keep in mind, in the 1970s, in this country, in the United States, we were dealing with 50 to 60 terrorist bombings a year. 50 to 60 terrorist bombings every year. More fatalities than we ever had in the years since 9/11. Their first bombs were amateurish. Often they blew themselves up. But they continued, and because there were gangs that actually had to come together physically, there was knowledge, there was memory, there was institutional learning. They got better and better, and they carried on campaigns. New World Liberation Front up in Northern California carried out 100 bombings. Weather Underground, somewhere between 40 and 50. Cubans down in Miami, anti-Castro Cubans, over 100 bombings. Puerto Rican separatists, another 70 to 100 bombings. These were campaigns. We don't see that because they're solitary actors now, so they go to do something, and it fails, and they're arrested, and the next one comes along and is an individual starting over from scratch. And so in that sense, the social media and the internet are impeding their effectiveness.
One more?
Sure, one more.
Last one over there.
When you were speaking earlier about things that haven't happened yet in the progression of terrorist activities, you mentioned large-scale chemical attacks and nuclear weapons being used. I thought you were going to end the sentence by saying it hasn't happened yet. With Pakistan having nuclear weapons, with Russia having thousands of tactical weapons, isn't this inevitable? And if it does happen, how does it up the ante?
You know, I can't make. I'm not recognized as an analyst, not in the field of prophecy. So I can't say what is going to happen and what is not going to happen. We have worried about nuclear terrorism. I'll just take the nuclear component since the late 1960s. There were many reasons that I thought it did not occur, in part because of the technical difficulties, in part because some of the other constraints. A nuclear weapon would not fit every group's objectives in the world. And so it hasn't happened. That doesn't mean it's not going to happen, but neither do I accept that it is inevitable, or to use the famous phrase, it's not a matter of if but when. I don't know that it's inevitable. Is the danger increasing as nuclear weapons become more widespread? I would say yes, our risks increase, and that is a cause of great concern. This is still a matter of concern, even if I don't think that nuclear terrorism is extremely likely. I do think that if there were an act of nuclear terrorism, to use everyone's favorite scenario, for some reason, poor Manhattan, by the way. Everyone always blows up Manhattan. You know, every scenario you read, supposing a 10 kiloton device, it's always a 10 kiloton device, by the way, is detonated Midtown Manhattan. And then it goes to elaborate what would involve. I can say, probably safely, that a post-nuclear terrorism world would be very, very different from the pre-nuclear terrorism world. That nations that thought having nuclear weapons were a strategic advantage, take Iran as an example, if, heaven forbid, there were a nuclear bomb to go off somewhere in the world, Iran might have about 15 minutes to persuade us that it wasn't them, and we might not give a damn. They'd say, well, would you be that cynical and I would say, in a post-nuclear terrorism world, we're not going to run the risk. It's an opportunity, and we're gonna do it. Now, if that sounds rough, I actually don't know what the president would do or what I would do were I president myself. But it ought to be in the calculation of any government that's thinking about it, that if you go this route, even if you think you're going to get away with it by giving it to Hezbollah or the ABC Liberation Front, that it's not going to make any difference. You are going to run some real risks in this. That ought to be part of their calculations. That is deterrence. And if that sounds crazy, it's no crazier than the deterrence we had during the Cold War. The deterrence during the Cold War is that the Soviet Union launches a strike, we launch a strike, and we end life on the planet. That's the response. People say, are you crazy enough to do that? Okay, do you want to run the test? No. And so that we have to take some very tough measures on this. I do believe in deterrence. I do believe that in the meantime we have to deal with the proliferation of nuclear weapons. And my biggest concern, honestly, you mentioned Pakistan, is not nuclear terrorism. It is that in some country with nuclear weapons, we will end up with the coup, the mutiny, the divided forces in which things break loose and things start there. And keep in mind, we are not the only actors in the world. I mean, something like that happens or threatens to happen. The missile launchers are coming up in Russia, they're coming up in the United States, they're coming up in India, they're coming up in Pakistan. They may even have weapons in Israel, where they're going to be coming up. Worldwide, we're going to go right to the edge on this one. In World War I, it took about a month between the assassination of the Crown Prince before we were into World War I. In this particular case, I give it about 30 hours.
On that note, you can make Santa Barbara if you hurry. Brian, I learned a lot tonight. I learned to never again ask you whether we're safer than we were before. Thank you so much for tonight.
Thank you. Thank all
you all
of you
for coming. Have a good night.